Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Serious, what dark family secret were you let in on? Once you were old enough? My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded incredibly stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened, and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home, and surprise! Took an extra couple of days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remembered this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed. My dad had the life he always wanted, so tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day Uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple of years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was floored. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her rage. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. Growing up, I always knew my parents had marital issues, constant fighting, a couple times Dad disappeared for a few days living in his car, issues with drinking. But they stayed together, and when I asked why they didn't divorce, they always said they loved each other too much. And in the past few years, things seem to have gotten better. My parents, in fact, are now so comfortable in their relationship that they make jokes about all the awful stuff they've done to each other in front of me. What I've managed to put together is: my parents met when they were 14 and my mother was dating an 18-year-old, and my dad would relentlessly ask her out until she eventually dumped her boyfriend for my dad. My mother went on to university after college, UK, whereas my dad dropped out of college and went straight into work while constantly drinking and partying. It was at one of these parties, while my mom was studying, that he cheated on my mom with someone from their old secondary school, so she dumps him. Barely a year later, my dad realizes he doesn't know how to do anything for himself, no one else wants him, and he goes crawling back to my mom. She agrees to take him back, but only if he marries her, not immediately, but eventually, she said. He agrees, and a short year after that, age 22 now, she's already pressuring him to propose. He fumbles it frankly. We're in Paris, but forgot the ring and proposed back in the hotel room after they'd visited the Eiffel Tower the day, which was her dream proposal, but she says yes. A month after they're married, Mum pressures him into having a child that he doesn't want, and 9 months later I was born. They soon realize how hard having a child is and basically pawn me off on my grandparents for the rest of my childhood. After me there were 2 more accidental babies, and each time my dad threatened to leave her if she didn't abort them. She managed to convince him to stay while keeping my siblings by promising he wouldn't have to raise them. He didn't, but neither did she. Frankly, I did. And that is only what happened before/shortly after I was born. If I carried on into my childhood, we'd be here for years. What they sold to me as the perfect love story, been together since they were 14, proposed in Paris, soon married, and had children because of pure love, is in fact a bunch of skewered half-truths from a horrible, twisted love map of my mother's manipulation and my father disappointing her repeatedly. I found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973 my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What's sort of tragic is all this time we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter but never got one due to marriage's ending. He would have loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter the mother had a mental breakdown no longer after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kind of went AWOL. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, my paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest, and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. My extremely wealthy uncle was going downhill quick with Alzheimer's. Before he was too far gone, he apparently made a deal with my aunt that when things got the point that they would have to send him to a nursing home, she would kill him instead. He wrote all of this in a letter and gave it to the attorney of their estate. When the time came, I don't know why she chose to shoot him in the back of the head instead of something less violent, but she did. It was a pretty big trial with a fair bit of news coverage, and it really blew up when the lawyer testified and brought forward the letter. My aunt served like 2 years I think and was released on parole. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window killing him. They lived in a rural area, so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean war officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad, and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got in trouble. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty ducked up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16 but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied with the dealers. I'm about his age now and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck. Never thinking something like that would get him killed. My older sister is not my full sister, she's my half-sister via my mother. My mother was married before and had my sister with her first husband. Her first husband raped my sister from when she was 2 or 3 years old. My mother caught him assaulting my sister, but no one believed her, and my sister was, from what I was told. My mother divorced him, and he tried to get custody of my sister, so she ran away with my sister, even cutting contact with her own family to keep my sister safe. A few years later she met my dad, who unofficially adopted my sister, and they had me. I grew up not knowing because my sister thought I might not love her the same if I knew we had different dads, and I think maybe some part of her wanted to forget her stepdad isn't really her biological dad. The only reason I ever found out when I was 20 is because somehow, my sister's biological grandmother found my mother's address and called. I answered the phone, and she mistook me for my sister. That was an interesting phone call and afternoon. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner, and that he was really involved with the union, but it wasn't until after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. Edit, for all the people saying my Gramps was a great man, thank you for the kind thoughts, but seeing something you think is cool on Reddit is not the reality. He wasn't a good husband, and he wasn't a great father to 3 of his daughters, although he loved my mama very much, as well as me and my brothers and cousins. Being a violent person for good reasons does not make you a good person. It just makes you a means to an end. I was pretty young when this happened, so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them, their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused as there had been no clue that they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later, but that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become extremely ill, the police officers came to tell the family, and they left emergently to care for her and never came back. I was only about 5. Seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered what ever happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and then killed the sitter. My mom stated the police officers think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home they checked the kids were safe and set them back to sleep. The police obviously immediately came. Once the kids were hard asleep the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, asked the police officers to be silent as they walked them out, and took them out of the house. They gave the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. Not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great-uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters as farmhands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farmhands were out drinking and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was throwing it from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed clean into 2 pieces. Because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who was more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it's something that definitely sticks in my mind. And it's a story I'll tell my own kids when they get their license. My paternal great-grandmother was owned by a wealthy cattle ranch around the turn of the last century on the Mexico-Texas border in the 1890s/1900s-ish. She didn't leave the ranch until she was 16 when she got pregnant and ran away because the baby belonged to the owner of the ranch, and she thought he'd kill her if he found out. It was strange to learn that the old lady that would hold me and sing to me as a kid spent the first decade and a half of her life as property. I wasn't told any of this until after my grandmother, her daughter, passed away. My great-grandmother was very ashamed of her past and I think by extension so was my grandmother. Looking at old photos of my grandmother and her older brother, the baby she had at 16, he does look strikingly more European than my grandmother and indigenous Mexican. My maternal grandfather was a pedophile and harmed my mother and her siblings. It was a well-known secret in the family which is even more disgusting. Growing up I used to spend the night at my dad's parents' house all the time, but I don't have a single memory of spending the night at my mom's parents' house. Never once sat on his lap. Never once did my mom ever allow him to hug us. I never understood why my mom was so cold to him when my father was so close with his own father. I grew up resenting my mom for withholding us from a whole other set of grandparents, and wished she would have told us sooner than when she finally did. I would have had more sympathy for her. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country, and it was getting dangerous to stay there, and for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with World War I right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. My great-grandparents left their spouses for each other. Great-grandpa was 37 and great-grandma was 19 in Ireland. My GGPA had 7 children. My GGMA had 3. They left their spouses and children in the middle of the night to run away together and move to America. Didn't say a word and never talked to them again. When my grandpa, their only child from their new life, would ask them about their past or family, they got really weird and would refuse to say anything. They took the secret to their graves. My grandpa at age 70 wanted an explanation about his heritage, so he signed up for Ancestry and 23andMe. Could you imagine how shocked he was to find out he had 10 siblings? They had been searching their whole lives to find out what happened to their parents. He got to meet them and would travel to visit them twice a year. My grandpa died 4 years ago. At least he got to know his siblings for a bit before he died. Happy, sad, and screwed up all at the same time. My uncle was a doctor working in a small-town hospital. He was married and had just had a baby boy. While his wife was pregnant or just had the baby, he had an affair with 2 nurses in the hospital and ended up getting one of the nurses pregnant. When he found out of the second kid, he took his family and went away to New Zealand for 3 years. Upon returning to Canada and the same small-town hospital, his wife immediately found out about his illegitimate child and divorced him. My illegitimate cousin stopped coming around to family events, and when I talked to him about it last year, he told me that my grandparents always blamed him for ruining my uncle's marriage. Let's say that my whole life I knew my grandmother's name to be Mary. Everyone called her this, everyone knew it. One day when I was in my 20s, I was with my grandmother and saw her sign some legal document. She signed it as Edith. I was horribly confused. I asked Grandma about it, and she said her name was Edith, but it was never spoken and to not use it. She is in her 80s at this point. Apparently my great-grandfather had been an Air Force pilot stationed in the UK during WW1. He had a girlfriend at the time named Edith. After the war was over, they broke up. Great-grandpa returned home and married great-grandma shortly after. They had only one child, a girl, whom he named Edith. Roughly 18 months later, my great-grandmother saw a letter in the mail from Edith and figured it out. She vowed the child would never be called the name ever again. She went by her middle name Mary, though it was never legally changed. My own mother states she did not know her own grandmother's name until she was 22. I have had fun randomly dropping this name bomb on cousins here and there and enjoying the shock and laughter about it. It's a silly secret that nowadays just makes people giggle. Found this out after my grandfather died. Growing up, every older guy in the neighborhood would say how tough he was. I mean, he was the most intimidating man I'd ever met. You would jump if he sneezed. I'm not even exaggerating. But I'd never seen him actually fight. But everyone, and I mean everyone, women and men, would say he never lost a fight and usually never had to throw more than one punch to knock someone out. But growing up, he would always preach to me and my cousins to never fight if you could help it. Just walk away. If they're insulting you, just walk away. It's only words. Sticks and stones and all that. Head drill it into our heads that you never fight unless you have to, and never under any circumstances do you throw the first punch. Ever. I was kind of confused. Every older person in our neighborhood would tell me how nobody ducked with Blackie because of how many people he knocked out, and he would always tell us not to fight. Turns out, when he was in his 20s, he got into a fight with someone. Apparently, the guy kept insulting him and wouldn't leave him alone. Finally, he had enough and cracked the guy. Knocked him out with one punch. The problem is, when he landed, he hit his head on a step. It was lights out for good. Killed him with one punch. I had never heard this story and was confused about how he didn't get locked up. Turns out he did. got like 15 to 20 years or something like that. Then WW2 happened. When I was a kid, I'd always ask my mom how my grandfather entered the war. Was he drafted or volunteered? She'd say, oh, it was like the movie The Dirty Dozen, which I had never seen or had any interest in when I was young, so I had no idea what that meant. Turns out the army made him a deal. Go to the front lines in Japan. If you live, well, expunge your record. If not, oh well. He went. Things made a lot more sense after that. This might be a bit too weird for this thread. I am from a country still enshrined in a lot of superstition and religion. My great-grandmother was a weird woman who practiced witchcraft. One day her husband died unnaturally, and Granny went mad. She gathered the village folk around and picked up a rock from the ground nearby and declared that the rock will be her curse and the village will suffer for killing her husband. After that she killed herself. For multiple generations, my family worshipped the rock as a deity and prayed to lift the curse from the village. It ended when my father in his 20s got sick of his family doing stupid things. He and his cousins stole the rock overnight from someone's house and threw it near a railway track. And no, I wish I were making this up, but my father, uncles and aunts all told me this story when I grew up. My grandmother raised her nephew after his parents died. I don't know what I thought happened to them, probably just assumed car accident. When I was 14 or 15 I asked my mom what happened, and she told me that it was a murder/suicide. Then she told me way more details that I probably shouldn't have been told and told me not to say anything to him because he had blocked it out and didn't remember most of the details. Years later we were talking and in the middle of an unrelated conversation, he said to me, I remember everything. It just came to me a few nights ago. I didn't know what to say, but then he asked if I knew the story and said I kind of did. He went into detail, and it was not fun, but I could tell it was cathartic for him. Next time I talked to my mom I let her know that he remembered and make it the same conversation. That was the last time I heard anything about his parents though. I was 6 or 7 when my father died. He was a terrible alcoholic, but I didn't understand alcohol as a kid. I'm 19 now and my mother has told me he wasn't just an alcoholic, he was a chronic liar, manipulator, and abuser. He strangled a dog and killed it in front of my mom because she was going to leave him. He was addicted to cocaine and when he didn't have any alcohol he'd sake my mom go get more or he'd kill another animal. He'd frequently beat the ever-living thing out of my mom and when she finally left with him my entire family both on my mom's and father's side talked shit about her leaving and didn't care about mine or her well-being. The worst part is when suing for custody he actually got weekends and then on Sunday would take me to the super nice churches that judges and lawyers involved with the case went to. My great-grandparents got drunk and locked 2 of my uncles out of the house late at night in the middle of winter. My great-grandparents wouldn't wake up and my uncles couldn't get in, so they tried to walk to their grandma's house that was like 15 miles away, and one of them froze to death and the other had to have been feet and hands amputated because of frostbite. My great-grandparents lied about what happened and said they snuck out. It was in the newspaper and was made out to be this heartbreaking story about 2 dumb little kids who snuck out in the middle of the night because they wanted to see their grandma. Several actually involving my paternal grandfather, Pa. He was a cattle rancher and long-distance truck driver. Pa was a terrible alcoholic who beat my granny on several occasions. My father was the one who would save her. He took several beatings doing this until he was old enough to stand on his own against his drunken father. He ran off and married another woman that he had been having an affair with for years. He had 4 boys with my granny and 4 children with the other woman as well. When Granny found out and found him she took him to court and the judge sent him home with her to raise my dad and uncles. She had to write the child support checks until the youngest turned 18. He had several children with other women, only a few we actually knew about. In his later years he was proud of all the kids he had all over the country. One of his daughters moved in with him after Granny died and a couple of years later they had a daughter. They were both fully aware that they were father and daughter. When I was 15/16 my parents got liquored one summer night with a bunch of their friends and I was told the story of how our house was bought from a murderer. Man, and his wife lived in the house my parents bought for I think 10 years, maybe less. Whatever triggered him, they didn't know, but he beat her to death with a cast iron pan and strangled her with a belt for good measure. left the body in the backyard poorly buried. He tried to kill himself by drinking a gallon of WD-40 and drowning himself in a body of water close to where I live. However, he tried to drown himself when the tide was coming in. Wasn't phenomenally successful, and the police found him half dead on the beach the next day after a neighbor got super suspicious about the grave in the backyard, and also all the unsure noises he heard the night before. I think he got 15 years for it, but I have no idea what his name is. I couldn't pry that part out of my parents, but his name was the last one on the house before my parents bought it when I was 4. My dad's friend committed suicide by shooting himself in the head in front of my dad and some other friends when he was 15 years old. They were all hanging out at the friend's house having an enjoyable time, when he went upstairs, grabbed his father's pistol, and came back down calling everyone's attention. He then put the gun to his head, squeezed the trigger, and collapsed behind a couch. They all thought it was some sort of sick joke at first, until they looked over the couch and saw his body and the blood. I first heard this story from my mom when I was 18, which explained some of my dad's behavior towards toy guns when I was a kid, but I never brought it up to him. I just hoped that one day he would open up to me about it, and eventually he did, but we haven't talked about it much since then. I'm amazed how my dad turned out to be such a great man having to experience something awful like that at such an early age, but according to him it's something that never left him either. He still has nightmares about it and gets really uneasy in movies and TV shows when they show someone getting shot in the head. Circa 1994 my dad died, 32, on Christmas Day. Instead of his family consoling my now single mother of 2, they decided it would be more appropriate to use their spare key to enter our house and clean out all his belongings while we were picking out a tombstone. All his tools, clothes, pictures, he was a model. Tenant Grandpa on Dad's side takes my mom to court while she's mourning to try to prevent her from using his life insurance to raise us. Sister and I were 5 and 6 at the time. He wanted all the money to be set aside until we were 18. The judge pretty much threw his case out. Needless to say, my mom distanced herself from his side. I don't speak with them either. Found this out when I was like 20. My relatives were a wealthy, childless couple in Chicago. Their housekeeper, who had a baby, took ill and was hospitalized. The couple took the baby to California and raised her on their own. This baby, Marie, grew up without siblings, as my grandmother's cousin. Marie discovered the truth as an adult, by accident. Even though this kidnapping happened over 100 years ago, I always wondered what became of that poor woman who was released from the hospital to find her baby had been kidnapped by her employers. I have a set of china dishes from Marie that I use at Thanksgiving, every year. Wild story. I had an aunt that I never met, and never knew she existed until very recently. I don't see that side of the family almost ever, because they kicked my grandma out of the family after she married a half-black guy. Anyway, this aunt spent the last 30 years of her life in Ancora, an inpatient psychiatric hospital. She lived a perfectly healthy and normal, albeit extremely racist, life until she was in her mid-40s. Then she found out that she was 25% black through some chain of events I still don't fully understand. Oh no. Lost it. She was so full of hate that her brain could not accept this information and it broke her. She would just scream the N-word at people and didn't really communicate in any other way. I'm convinced Dave Chappelle heard this story and made his black, white supremacist skit. She stayed there until she died. I know extreme hate like that can duck with people's brains, but I mean, my father is from small working town in eastern Ukraine. And most of our lives we've been poor. But my mother always praised my father for his ability to know the perfume by smell, and not only that but also he can recognize many famous perfumes by smelling them. Once, when I was 20-something years I asked, why is that so? Where did he obtain this skill? My father asked me to not ever tell this story to my mother. And here's the story. My father had a close friend who was actually a secret lover of one of the most famous Soviet singers, who officially had a wife. But it's reality he was gay and did a lot for gay community in Soviet Union. He brought a lot of expensive things from abroad, like recent music, clothes, and perfumes. And a lot of that perfume has been met at secret parties. This gay friend of my father also gave him all the fresh music releases vinyl and he sold it, and they shared the profit, unofficially of course. That's why my dad knows release years of most hits from 60s and 70s. And more of that, he told me about Special Square in Sochi, the place of Olympic Games 2014, where gay people of USSR met each other and what secret signals they had. My grandma and uncle were both diagnosed with cancer in the 90s. My uncle went into remission, grandma died. Almost a decade later, my uncle's cancer came back in full force. He and his partner of 40 years were hoarders. My mom/his sister didn't realize this initially because they lived about 2 hours apart. She only knew after her first visit to help take care of him. We all made several trips to help clean up. On one of these occasions, Uncle's common-law husband mentions he needs to hit up the P.O. box as they haven't collected mail in a few days. Mom offers to drive him. When they get back to the house, Mom notices a letter from the IRS addressed to Grandma. Weird because Grandma hasn't been alive to file taxes in almost 10 years. Turns out Uncle and Grandma had a joint bank account. He never notified authorities of her death. She still got direct deposits from Grandpa's government pension post-mortem because the government didn't know she was dead. Not only did my uncle illegally receive thousands of dollars of my grandma's pension, but he also had several maxed-out credit cards. He knew that cancer coming back was a death sentence and decided to celebrate while he was still here. My grandparents were rather poor, and when all of my grandfather's crops had failed they were desperate. They had a lot of mouths to feed as the church didn't allow them to use birth control. They applied to the local poor fund, which helped the poor make ends meet or at least put some food on the table. But my great-grandfather was on the board of the fund and denied their request since he didn't want people to know a son of his was using the poor fund. What would people think of him? He would rather keep his pride than feed his own son and grandkids. And that's why now, about 70 years later, over 50 of his own offspring still curse his name. This was not the only awful thing he did to keep up appearances. I'm 25 and recently found out the man I know as my dad isn't my biological father. My bio father left my mother shortly before I was born because he believed he was an angel sent by the archangel, Michael, to prepare for Armageddon. His family probably doesn't even know I exist. Last my mom heard of him, I was 10 and he was going to court for assaulting a teenager. So, I hope he's having a phenomenal time getting his ass beat in prison. On the lighter side of things, the man I know as my father met me on my first birthday shortly after he started dating my mom. Apparently we spent the day eating fruit snacks and watching Teletubbies together. He pretty much adopted me as his own in that moment, and knowing who my biological father is doesn't change how I see and how much I love my dad. My husband's family has a dark secret that still isn't out to the people who really need to know, and I hate that I know. His youngest aunt was sent away when she was a teenager, and shortly after she returned, the oldest uncle and his wife introduced the family to their daughter. Young aunt went on to have 3 more kids who have no clue that their cousin is actually their half-sister. What's even more fat up is that her brothers know the secret. I'm dreadful that someone will need a donor or do an ancestry test and all the lies will be exposed. Glad I could get that off my chest. If you're assuming this is a good Christian family, you would be correct. It's all about appearance. How many of my family members were molesters? And the reason one of my uncles had to choose between prison and Vietnam was likely related to the previous fact, but my grandparents would never really talk about it. That my grandmother was basically sold to her first husband at 14 years old by her own mother. Grandma never talked about the time she was with him or how the marriage even came about. But other family members admit that my great-grandma had a sudden influx of cash after agreeing to let her daughter marry this older man that had been hanging around. Only lasted a few months, and there's no evidence they were ever legally married. When I was 15 or so, my uncle was talking to me about my mom. She's always been the odd one out of the family, as was I. She had a lot of mental health and addiction struggles. Well, he randomly decides to tell me about the child she gave up for adoption at the age of 16. She always told me I was the only one. Had me at 31 years old. I kept this knowledge from her for almost 10 years. Maybe thought she'd bring it up and I didn't want to step on my toes or trigger something, but we were on the phone one day and actually having a polite conversation. So, I just asked her. And she confirmed. Told me she used to work at the county clerk's office and went snooping for her file one day. She said she had found her, and her name was Jennifer, but she couldn't bear to look at anything more. Left it at that. 2 months later she had a debilitating stroke and has global aphasia, can't communicate with hand movements and facial expressions. I'm glad we got to air that out before this happened. I thought about looking for my half-sister but wouldn't know where to start. Did 23 me and she wasn't listed. Though maybe I ran into her a few years ago. I was at a conference, and I heard this laugh. Sounded just like my mom's. Discovered her name was Jennifer. But, you don't just go asking people if they were adopted. You knows? Looked like she could be related to that side of the family, too. Could have been just me trying to formulate it to make sense in my head, but yes, still think about her from time to time. She'd be close to 43 years old, I believe. That I was adopted by my auntie and her husband. My real father, her brother, was institutionalized after taking too much acid and losing his mind. He had asked and remained in hospital until he passed away. My real mother was Swedish and was a heroin addict and was unable to look after me. I was still in a pram at the age of 3 and unable to walk as I'd never been taught. I have 2 sisters by the mother who I've never met who probably don't know about me, and they were taken into care by social services. The real mother is believed to be dead now and was untraceable. I had a sad, hard, often cruel, and unloving childhood. As the adoptive mother felt she had been lumbered with me. I found all this out at the age of 21 and had no idea at all about any of it. I'm now 53, happy and grateful. This is only a tiny part of my life that has been rocky to say the least. Oh well, that's life I suppose. My dad moved out of the house about a year when I was like 9. They told us at the time that it was because his commute was just too long, so he was going to have this apartment to make it easier to get to work. We'd go visit at weekends. There was a pool, so to our kids' brains it was awesome. I figured out in high school that my parents had separated then. I asked my mom and she confirmed and said Dad had also had a girlfriend then. I immediately asked if it was Amy, because there'd been this one woman who'd suddenly been around a lot and then never again. Weirdly, it wasn't even her. It was a different girlfriend, but Mom had always had a suspicion about Amy too. My parents had reconciled, had another kid, and then split up again when I was a senior in high school. My dad is a serial cheater. He cheated on my mom with younger women the entirety of their 15-year marriage. After my mom was disabled in an accident, he cheated increasingly. He'd take the one car and go off for the day whenever he has a day off instead of helping my mom take care of my older siblings. He was not present during my birth because he was out cheating on my mom with the woman he would in 3 years divorce her for. Marrying this woman the day my parents' divorce finalized. Also, during the divorce my uncle and aunt almost adopted me, which every single day I wish they would have. Don't get me wrong, I love my mom and she tried to do everything she could for us kids, but I would give anything to have a normal family. My whole young adult life I was told not to spend the night at boys' places, that I needed to wait until marriage to have sex, that I shouldn't move in with a partner until we were married, etc. This caused me to deal with a lot of guilt and shame around my dating life throughout my 20s. When I was a teenager, my older brother knocked up his now wife when they were 20 and unmarried, and it felt the biggest scandal to hit my family. My parents and grandparents were not supportive of them. It wasn't until I was almost 30 that my parents revealed to me that my grandparents eloped to Vegas because they had conceived my oldest aunt out of wedlock and that my parents secretly lived together a year before they were married. Not big dark secrets to me now, but I can't help but feel like I live in a family full of hypocrites. My mom once told me a story from when she was a kid. She had gone to the park with her 2 younger sisters and their dog. While at the park, a man approached my mom, and she said then that the dog went absolutely crazy and would not back down. So, the man left her and my aunties alone. Later that day, the police arrived at the family home looking to speak to my mom. It turns out the man had lured another girl and then raped and murdered her. Needless to say, I think she was forever grateful for her dog protecting her. When I was about 10, I got a hamster for my birthday. It got out one night, and my mom found it while I was at school the next day. No harm done. When I was 18, my older brother told me our dog devoured that hamster and our mom replaced it with a different one while we were at school. I didn't believe him, so we called our mother. She said my brother is a man and not to listen to him. I said it was almost 10 years ago, and I wanted to know. She stuck by her story. When our father got home that night, I asked him how many hamsters I had. His response was, "Oh my God, like 4. I can't trust anyone." For my entire life, my very white family has taken a lot of pride in the fact that my grandfather's grandma was a full-blooded Indian. No one could really say what tribe, but my grandpa said she had traveled north from Alabama. There was one existing picture of her in her old age in the 20s, and she kind of looked like an apple doll, just indiscernibly wrinkled. My family, like most white people, are that quiet kind of there goes the neighborhood racist, but being native is a special exception, so my mom got really into collecting Danbury mint porcelain dolls of indigenous people, and my aunt did her whole living room with tacky pictures of braves of horses and feathered drums. One cousin who was particularly obsessed with this identity had a huge custom-made headdress done for some kind of Zumba cruise she went on. Well, so anyway, I'm in my 30s and working at a TV studio, and they need extras to get ancestry DNA tests for a new segment. I'm all in, and my story was that I was fairly sure about my grandpa's side, but my grandma was adopted, so her background was kind of a mystery. I do the test and lo and behold, I am 0% indigenous, but 4% black, which if you do the math means my great-great-grandma was not native but a native-passing black woman. The absolute joy I took in my family learning on national television that we are A, not native, and B, actually an ethnicity they were regularly weird and was a thrill I have not tasted since then. I have a cousin who I was informed has special needs. Never understood why, only that he was a bit of a slow learner and had some minor health issues. Found out when I was a teenager he wasn't really a blood relation. His mother married my uncle, my mom's brother, when they were fresh out of school. She was pregnant and everyone assumed it was his. The baby was not his. My aunt had been repeatedly raped by her father her entire life. She finally ended up pregnant. My uncle and her were dating but never had penetrative sex. She told him the truth after she found out she was pregnant. They decided to raise the baby themselves to keep it away from her father. The only way they could do that was if they got married because she was still under 18. My uncle raised my cousin as his own, even though he knew he wasn't. They loved and cared for the kid. Due to the circumstances surrounding his conception, he ended up with behavioral and health issues but was loved and given everything they could give him. He still doesn't know he's fine, just still a bit slow. My great-grandfather was a Nazi and a traitor to our country, Norway. He held political office during the war, and his case is listed in the treason settlement case. We were never told about him or about our ancestry nor the fact that our family up until the 60s held special privileges as a result of our ex-time's grandfather getting letters patent from the king for his trading and fishing village that had been in the family for 300 years. What in Norwegian is called a verifier or noskone, petty king who owns sizable tracts of land and has special privileges with trade of goods, fish, and yada yada. My mom grew up hearing about this stuff, how special and grand they were because of this, and rightly said this is ridiculous. I was almost 30 before I knew any of this. Oh, and our ancestors owned plantations and slaves in the West Indies, so that's a thing. Also, something like my 6 times great-grandfather started the genocide against our country's native peoples. One night at dinner my dad kind of trauma dumped, in his own reserved way, about his mom and his brother. My grandma was always kind of on the outskirts of my life, and despite her living close by I never saw her that much. She would sometimes drop off toys for us then drive away when we got home from school. I eventually figured out that she had gambling and substance abuse problems and that she divorced my grandpa when my dad was in high school. I also knew that my dad had a younger brother who died getting hit by a car when he was incredibly young. At dinner one night, can't remember how it came up, he said he knew that his mom had killed his brother. It was just after the divorce between my grandma and grandpa, and apparently his brother missed his mom and called for her to pick him up at like 3 a.m. so she drives drunk over there but accidentally hits him in the road outside the house. Then she drives off. I never suspected that it was something that bad, despite always having a hunch that there was more to the story. My uncle's year-long health trip where he biked everywhere was actually the result of him getting a DUI. It was a real hush until the cousins, and I grew up. Now only my nanny doesn't know which was the real reason for the hush. My grandma didn't actually marry my grandpa out of love. Sure, love developed, but her family was actually moving to Victoria, selling their house, and she wasn't allowed to come. She was 16 and had to figure it out. She lived in a small town, and a new guy moved into town to start a farm. Her friends always told me she had her sights set on him the moment she saw him in swing dance, but I never realized the motive wasn't just cute guy twice my age and was have to get married young for survival. Also, we're all German? Was never told until my mid-20s. I guess my family immigrated here and changed their last names and kept it hush-hush. Have no idea why, but it can't be good. Add on to that my ex-boyfriend's grandma telling me about the time she was raped as a youth in Ireland, and that none of her family knew and asked me to keep it to myself. I wonder if I'm the only person she's shared that with in true honesty after 50 years. My family doesn't have any dark secret, but apparently my grandparents became orphans during or right after World War II. My grandfather was 10 when the war ended, and were just poor in the American section of Germany. When they were old enough to marry, they somehow managed to get some money and found their way to Brazil in what was the last largest wave of German immigration to Brazil, and then enlisted to work in a colonization company. So that's basically the story of a lot of people from where I come from. Now there's the darkish part. My grandparents took quite a bit to learn both Portuguese or the locally used dialects, so they hired a live-in kid from a less wealthy, also immigrant family to serve as translator/cupbearer, which while the kid attended school and wasn't doing any physically demanding labor, but having a child worker living in is uncomfortably close to restive. I found out when visiting their town, and basically they are saying, "Oh, we raised that guy before we had your dad and aunties." The man turned out all right and now owns a farm equipment and supply shop. My grandma on my father's side left her 4 kids, and my grandpa for another man, became an alcoholic and lived on the streets for 5 years. She would prostitute herself to get money for alcohol, and her BF even encouraged it so he could get alcohol too. My grandpa had to work full-time to support his kids, so my oldest aunt, who was 16 at the time, basically raised my father and 2 aunts. My grandma only came back because my grandpa died young from a heart attack. Legally still married, she got everything, moved her BF in, and then acted as if nothing ever happened. Growing up, my father would praise his mother and always talk about his dad. For years I believed my grandpa was evil, when in fact he was a lovely man. My father was always getting in trouble and my grandpa tried his best, but my dad was wild. My grandma would let him do whatever he wanted, so obviously he preferred her. Makes me ill thinking she would talk trash about my grandpa to people when he did nothing but love her and his kids. He tried once to get her back before he died, and my grandma spit in his face and called him pathetic. Wasn't till I was in my early 20s that my auntie let me know what my grandma had done. I only remember her as the lady who made me uncomfortable and smell like an ashtray. I was not old enough for this story. I believe I was 15. This happened when I was 13. There was a Sunday that my parents packed my sister and I in a car where we went house to house of people we didn't know and were either told to stay in the car or in the living room with the adults in another room. We were told to shut up when we asked what was going on. Turns out, my father had had 2 illegitimate sons from 2 different women and was feeling bad about it. So, my mother and he set out to find them. Both of these women knew each other. When they both were old enough to start asking about their father, they took them to a cemetery, showed them a gravesite and said, "Your father is dead." One son was in the Navy, the other was in college. Neither woman wanted to change their stories and threatened to sue my father if he ever approached them. Both of my parents are pieces of work, as is the rest of my family, which is why I'm not in contact with them all, including my nieces and nephews who are also unwilling to work on their issues. I was too young to know, and the only reason my mother told me the story was that she was mad at my father for going on yet another drinking binge, and I asked. Not really a family secret, it was common in Poland during the war, just something my parents never brought up until I was in my 30s and started asking family history. My grandfather was in a slave labor camp building fortifications for the Nazis and got a little self-assertive with an SS officer at one point, who immediately took out his gun and threatened to kill him. My grandmother had to beg for his life, but given the circumstances likely involved more than begging. When the Soviets came through at the end of the war, they raped and murdered the mother and daughters at the next-door neighbors, but somehow my grandmother and her oldest daughter, my oldest aunt, came through. Not clear why my grandparents were spared, probably just luck of the draw. They went to that house first and spent their bloodlust. When my mom was pregnant with me, my family lived in a trailer on some property. It was my dad, mom, and sister who was about 3 years old. They were out of town visiting my aunt and uncle. The trailer was struck by lightning and burned down. It was a complete and total loss. My dad always said that had they been there, he didn't think there was any way for all three of them to get out. I remember my sister telling me how she lost everything. Our cousin who was about the same age as my sister donated some of her Barbies etc. Point being, we talked about this throughout my entire life. But one time, when I was about 40, my sister and I were visiting our dad. Our mom had passed away several years before. He mentioned how much the guy down the road didn't like them, and he's fairly sure he set the fire. My sister and I kind of looked at each other like, did you know this? Then we asked our dad to expand. For it having been 40 years before, he still had a good explanation of why he thought it was probably him. This has more to do with my cousin than myself, but my aunt got pregnant as a teen and was sent away to a birth camp. It was the early 60s, so that was still a thing. The baby went to adoption and aunt returned home. Several years later she married a guy, and they have my cousin. Come forward 40 years and my cousin, having been told this secret, tracks down her half-sister. Makes contact and wants to surprise her mom with her long-lost daughter. Many surprises were had. The adopted daughter had spent much of her youth in foster homes, abused and naturally rebellious as a result. Ended up in legal troubles and unbeknownst to anyone else, was on probation when my cousin flew her out of CAF to Alaska. She stole, was manipulative, and when the police showed up to take her in custody for probation violation, she left to go to some remote village with some guy she met. Rumor is that it was not the only baby she gave up for adoption. My cousin did not do any more digging. My grandfather came to the United States using a fake name. Before World War II my grandfather was in the circus and traveled Europe. Because of this he spoke 11 languages. When the Nazis invaded Ukraine they forced him to be a translator. They made him shoot people with a gun to his head, and it was either my grandfather or the poor other person. One day he went into a Nazi officers' club and set a bomb, blowing up the entire club with many high-ranking officers there. He ran away after that and was wanted by the Soviets for being a collaborator and wanted by the Nazis for killing all the officers. He found a dead guy in a ditch and stole his identity. He used the assumed identity for the rest of his life. I've had this grandma, the mom of my father, who I have not seen, heard, or even known her name. From my mother's side, her parents were always kind to me, and my mom has left me to stay at their village house on multiple summer vacations, along with my brother and sister. I've always found this odd throughout my childhood because the other grandma I had would pop up in taboo family conversations, kind of like the Nine-Tails Fox secret in Naruto anime. Everybody knew everything about her, and I was the one who was clueless. This went on for a while and I pressed on my parents to reveal the secret as to why and what was happening. Bear in mind I was about 12-13 years old at the time. One day, my parents were coming home from a restaurant party or whatever and they were moderately drunk. I decided now's my chance since people oftentimes slip up when they're drunk. Upon asking, my mother looked me in the eyes for about 3 or 4 seconds before responding and said, when I was pregnant with you, I went with your dad to see your grandmother and announced that she will be soon a grandmother. She said to me that she would kill the baby and would never let you to be born. I was in shock honestly. My dad immediately sobered up and tried to put me to bed. Fast forward to 2019 when my father receives a call that my grandmother had passed away. Most ironic part is my father had inherited her apartment in a big city where I also got a job in 2019 and I still sometimes use when going to the office. I never met my mom's grandfather even though he died when I was in 4th or 5th grade. I met his wife, my great-grandmother, but only a handful of times. Those few times were awkward, and my mom was tense during each visit. As an adult, my mom got drunk one night and spilled several generations worth of generational trauma. Her grandfather was a rapist. He sexually assaulted all 5 of his daughters, my grandmother and her sisters, which resulted in one getting pregnant as a teenager. He forced her to keep the pregnancy. They claimed some boy at her high school was the father, but everyone knew what was really happening. No one stepped in to stop it. Not even his wife tried to protect those girls. I don't have a relationship with my grandmother because she's a mean-spirited racist. But sometimes I think about the trauma she loved through and my heart hurts for the person she could have been if her father hadn't been a monster. My mom refused to say if he ever touched her but confirmed that he had harmed several of her cousins and several of her cousins' children. She was the only member of the family who refused to allow him access to her children. My great-aunt, the one who became pregnant with her father's child, called her own granddaughter an attention-seeking *re when she was molested. She was 10. Bastard lived until he was nearly 100 and traumatized several generations of our family tree. I have one that is dying with my parents' generation that I am one of the only 2 people of my generation to know about and planned to keep buried. When my mother was a teenager, 19-ish years old, she got engaged to a man, around 22, after dating for like 3 years. I should mention this was in Germany and this is relatively normal for the time. It was my concern too. A few months before their wedding, my mother found her fiancé and her older sister who would have been around 28 years old sleeping together. The 2 of them came out as lovers and hijacked the wedding-to-be and get married themselves. They then proceeded to have 2 children, both of which are my cousins. Said cousins are around 34 and 39 now, but for a hot minute it was a pretty touchy subject in the family. My mother and my aunts told this to me and said to never let the next generation know to let it die out. There is a good amount more, but that is the one I think about most often. Our family's pet when I was incredibly young was a little miniature shepherd. When he died I was heartbroken. My dad went to the woods behind our house and buried him. We made a wooden cross with his name carved into it and had a funeral. I would go out there every now and then to leave flowers or a piece of bacon on his grave in his memory. I maintained that cross for years. Fast forward 35 years. I live at the same house I grew up in and have kids of my own. Our dog died, so I decide to bury her in the same clearing in the woods. I take a shovel and I start digging. The shovel hits solid rock about 3 inches down. I tried in other spots and it's all the same. The entire clearing has no trees because there is only 3 inches of soil before hitting bedrock. I gave bacon to an empty grave while our little dog was probably tossed into a ditch somewhere all those years ago. I totally get it though. I was out after midnight finding a place to bury our dog. It was cold and miserable and a lot of work. No hard feelings, Dad. You always did right for us. After my parents both passed away, my grandmother mentioned something about my mom and her first husband. Apparently when she was 16, she eloped with a guy in her high school and was missing for a couple of months. My grandfather tracked them down and dragged her back to the house, and the marriage was annulled. My brother later found the ex-husband on Facebook, who apparently is living a good life with a long-lasting marriage and several children and grandchildren. My brother didn't reach out to him, because he figured to leave the past in the past rather than to potentially stir up some 60-year-old teenage foolishness. Not necessarily a dark secret, but it was a secret that the entire family managed to keep to my parents' graves, and for about 5 minutes afterward, lol. When I was younger, I remember my mom frantically getting me in the car and speeding to my paternal uncle's house. She made me stay in the car and told me to keep my head down until she came to get me. I, of course, under the circumstances, didn't listen and peeked over the edge of the window multiple times, and one of the last times I seen EMTs rolling a stretcher out with a blanket over a person and into the ambulance. She finally comes out to get me, and I'm walking around the silent kitchen, my uncle, his partner, my granny, and my mom quietly. I finally gained the courage to ask if Granny was okay and who was on the stretcher, and they said it was my dad. I never asked until a few months later when I was at Granny's house with my papa and dad because my mom had to do something that's not important. My dad had guided me into the bathroom and whispered super quietly that I was old enough to know about this and to not tell my mom because she didn't think I was old enough to see, as he parted his short hair and showed staples in his head. I was horrified to say the least. I found out later in life when I was a teenager that he had tried to off himself with a hammer that day, and that's why he was in the ambulance and why he had staples. I believe I was 9 when hammer time happened. Great-granddad was an Irish traveler who settled in Yorkshire way back. Back in the day you had to pay a tax to work down the coal mines. My great-granddad wasn't paying no tax. The tax collector didn't make it out of the mine, was hailed as a hero of sorts by the poor village people. An uncle came home drunk one day and got into a fight with his wife and stabbed her 70+ times, the last one pinning her arm to the ground. He ran away to the French Foreign Legion and apparently sent to Algeria, in the 70s. Another uncle from the same side of the family wanted to be an SAS soldier but was dyslexic, ended up drinking himself to death. Another played professional rugby league for a local team but couldn't stay off the drink so got fired. He still holds the club's highest career tries record. If he got sent off for foul play he would break into people's cars, so he would get away with a lot because the ref wanted him in the car where he left it. Once he got sacked he moved to pinching people garden shed doors. He died poor and drunk in a hostel at like 40. Another uncle, same side, just got 15 years for BNE, he's 64. My granddad had a scar on his shin. He got shot in the leg with birdshot when a fight got out of hand. My late grandpa was a closeted gay man living in the South. He and my grandma had a male roommate while they were married, and apparently my grandma didn't figure out that the roommate was more than just a roommate to my grandpa until her father, my great-granddad, pointed it out to her. Then they divorced and she married his best friend. Grandpa never came out of the closet and spent his years suffering alcoholism until he ultimately killed himself right after my brother, his first grandchild, was born. His children still don't know that he was gay. My grandma told me about it years ago and I told all of my cousins but couldn't bring myself to tell my parent or aunt. It didn't feel like my story to tell. I wish that he could have lived to see how different the world is now. There are several queer people in my family and aside from the occasional ignorant comment from the older generation, they are all loved and accepted as they are. I have never met him, but I think about him a lot and feel very connected to him. Nobody ever talks about him in my family, and it makes me so sad. I hope he is resting easy now. I discovered I have an older sister that tried to burn my brother and I alive. She's 10 years older than us and has been in a facility ever since. She's diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and has extreme violent outbursts. She's injured several patients and faculty. When my dad had a stroke, I was collecting information for his insurance and there she was holding me and my brother. Mom just said, well, we knew you'd find out eventually. So, all those trips out, they were actually going to visit my sister. My brother and I are just 11 months apart and we were incredibly young when they had her admitted. I have no memory of her. On my first visit with her she hugged me and said, I love you little bro, and she was crying. I thought I might get to know her, but that was the only time she should have any emotion for me. Her caregivers said they'd never seen her hug anyone. Not even my parents. She's in there somewhere because I met her for a few minutes. Her voice sounded like Mom's, and we favored each other. I drop off things for her every month, and poke my head to say hello sis, hoping to see that lady I met on our first visit, but nothing yet. She'll see me again. I hope so. Someone broke into our home and sexually assaulted my mother when I was little. It's never been talked about besides when I was told, but apparently I was in the room. I have no memory. It explains a lot about my mom and childhood though. Why we moved states, why my mom went to a hospital for a while, she tried to kill herself, why she shut herself down entirely for so long, why the family dog hated men so much, why I can't watch a sexual assault scene in a movie or show without having a panic attack. She's doing better now thankfully. Unrelated to above, but I also learned I had an older sister my mom had given up for adoption when she was a teenager. She was a minor and her boyfriend was in his mid-20s. She told me when I was in my early 20s. A few years later I got a Facebook request from someone. I looked at their profile and the person were looking for their birth parents. She'd posted the information the adopted agency could give it. It didn't say my mom's name, but it fit her and what I knew about her at the time to a T. It turned out to be my sister. She got to come meet my mom and even attended my wedding and we still keep in touch. When I was around 30 years old, I was told that an older second cousin had possibly killed a man. This was in rural Kentucky in the 1960s. My cousin was, and probably still is, an ignorant hillbilly racist, but I don't associate with that side of my family and haven't in decades. As the story goes, the cousin and his friends, all of them white teenagers, were drunkenly joyriding country roads in the back of a pickup truck and saw a black man walking up ahead. One of the idiots grabbed a brick and smashed the man in the head with it as they drove by. They obviously didn't stop to see if he lived or died. They came into my grandma's kitchen laughing and proudly boasting about what they had done. My young mother was there and overheard them, and it scared her. She was told/threatened to never tell a soul. She left that town and state for a reason, and we never visited or had a relationship with that side of the family for the same reason. Since I learned of this, I have searched desperately, from afar, for any record of this happening, because I would eagerly turn my cousin into the authorities, or better yet, that poor man's family/descendants for some rural country justice. If anyone knows of any unsolved story like this, please message me. My great-grandfather was found deceased inside a walk-in freezer some 70 years ago. Growing up, I loved my grandfather's stepfather and knew that my grandfather's biological father had died long before I was born. Eventually, I learned that my biological great-grandfather had died locked inside a freezer. Local newspapers reported the death as a suicide at the time. The story turns even darker when I learned that my grandfather attempted to lock himself in the freezer as he did not believe the suicide explanation and found that he could not. According to my mom, there was actually another man in town, not my grandfather's stepfather, who had at the very least developed feelings for my great-grandmother. And that he and my great-grandfather never got along. I never heard anything else about what happened to that man, but I know that no charges were ever brought up. My mother's a white woman and my father's an immigrant from Mexico. I always wondered why I was kept away from my dad's side of the family growing up, always felt like I was deprived of so much culture and missed so many events. I don't speak Spanish and we were never close to any of my cousins on that side of the family. It wasn't long ago where after I went through a few rather traumatic experiences where my mother explained that one of my uncles was molesting my older siblings back before I was born. It all made sense from then. My dad's family swept it under the carpet, and it was never acknowledged, so my parents kept us away for our safety. Of course, as time went on, my family got back in touch with our cousins. We will visit them and of course have some of them visit for the holidays. I've met all of my aunts and uncles except for that one. He was of course forbidden from coming into our lives again. Funny thing is, this uncle just died the other day. My knowledge of him was minimal save for the fact that he was a peso who dealt with addiction and alcoholism. Some of my cousins were posting memorials for them saying things like "Rest in peace, Tia." Of course, I was confused and shocked because I assumed one of my dad's sisters had passed away too. My cousin explained to me that this uncle had transitioned. I apologized for not knowing and said, my family has always had a bit of a shaky relationship with them, and my cousin said she was troubled and had problems with the rest of the family as well. I've been seeing a lot of family posts and local LGBT groups saying how she was such a wonderful woman who never deserved the struggle she dealt with, but it feels so vile to see such things said about such a foul person. And I'm positive they'd preyed on my other cousins with the way my cousin explained her problems. My grandmother was born in China to a Russian mother during the Sino-Japanese War. When I was in elementary school and doing a family tree project, she told me that her father's name was Nikolai Smirnov, and he was dead. When I was a little older, I was told that my grandmother's father was Chinese. It was only when I was 17 and after my grandmother took a DNA test that I learned the truth. Her father was a Japanese soldier, and the circumstances around my grandmother's conception point to events that may have been non-consensual. If you've read anything about what the Japanese were doing in China during the Sino-Japanese War/World War II, well, you know. So, in all likelihood, my great-grandfather was a war criminal. My grandmother told me that my dad had been married and had other daughters, all of which existed before my sister and me. My sister and I had been the product of an affair between my mom, who was friends with my dad's kids, and my dad, who was 30-odd years her senior. Our mom never told us any of this. Our dad living 3 hours away was our normal. We never questioned it, as it was just how our life was. He financially supported my mother and paid hefty child support until we were adults. His actual presence varied throughout our childhood, never being around for more than a weekend or a few days at a time. I don't know if his wife ever knew, now deceased. I did reach out to one of his daughters a while back after not hearing from him for months. It was not well received. I was 14 when I found out my brother was actually my half-brother. My mom had been married for a brief time before my dad to a good man with bad health. He died after a year. She then started dating my brother's biological father. She broke up with him and found out she was pregnant after meeting my dad. My dad married our mother and adopted my brother. I never knew anything about this until I returned home from school and found my brother had left for a trip to meet his bio dad. Mom passed almost a decade ago, and my dad never regretted marrying her or adopting my brother. I never saw my half-brother as anything other than my brother. My great-aunt got pregnant as a teenager in the 1930s. The father was the married minister of their church. She had an abortion and the family acted like it had never happened. My mom's cousin hung himself in the late 50s or early 60s. They believe it was because he was secretly gay. Two of my great-grandfathers, one didn't allow his daughters to read. If they put their elbows on the table, he would make them sit at the table with their chin propped up on a stick. The other was a deadbeat, abusive alcoholic. My grandfather came home from school one day to find his wheelchair-bound mother with his younger siblings and all their possessions on the front porch of the house. They had been evicted because his dad didn't bother to pay the bills and was nowhere to be found.